rain fell on London in a perpetual sooty drizzle, a fitting baptism for the day Arthur Pembroke's life fractured into a before and after. He stood, collar turned up against the grime-laced damp, on the cobblestones of a fashionable square that had never wanted his kind. The houses were great, hulking testaments to brick and privilege, their windows glowing with a buttery light that seemed to mock the gray twilight. In his hand, clutched so tightly the cheap paper threatened to fuse with his skin, was a solicitor's letter. The words swam before his eyes even now. The sole beneficiary, the entire fortune of Sir Reginald Croft, estimated at £1,000,000. £1,000,000. The number was an abstraction, a mythical beast from a storybook. Arthur, at 26, was a man of grit and grime, his world defined by the weight of a coal sack and the ache in his shoulders at day's end. He was the son of a coal merchant, and after his father's lungs had given out, the son was the coal merchant. His kingdom was a soot-blackened yard in the warren of Southwark, his throne a splintered desk, and his crown the perpetual dust under his nails. The scent of coal was woven into the very fiber of his being, a perfume of poverty and toil. Sir Reginald Croft had been a spectre from his mother's past, a distant, fabulously wealthy relation who had disapproved of her marrying a man in trade. Arthur had met him once as a boy, a stern-faced man in a library that smelled of old leather and port, who had looked at Arthur's patched knees with a mixture of pity and disdain. Now, that man was dead, and with a stroke of a pen, he had plucked Arthur from his life and dropped him into another entirely. His instructions were to present himself at the offices of Sterling and Gray, solicitors, in Mayfair. Pushing through the heavy oak door felt like crossing a border into a foreign land. The air was warm, smelling of beeswax and old money. A clerk in an immaculate suit looked up, his eyes performing a swift, dismissive inventory of Arthur's worn coat and scuffed boots. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone implying the opposite. "Arthur Pembroke. I have an appointment with Mr. Sterling." The name, spoken in this hallowed space, had a magical effect. The clerk's demeanor shifted from boredom to obsequiousness so rapidly it was comical. He was ushered into a room where the carpet was so thick it swallowed sound. Mr. Sterling, a man with a face like a kindly bloodhound, laid it all out. The investments in railways and shipping, the estates in the country, the townhouse here in London, all his. There were conditions, of course. He must take the Croft name to honor the lineage. He must be educated, polished, transformed from what he was into what a man of his new station ought to be. A ghost of a smile touched Arthur's lips. "You mean, I must learn not to smell of coal." Mr. Sterling had the grace to look faintly embarrassed. "We prefer to think of it as acquiring the appropriate patina." The first test of this patina came a week later, under the glittering chandeliers of a charity ball at Larkspur Manor, the home of the Earl of Havelock. Arthur, now Arthur Croft, felt like a wolf in borrowed evening wear. The suit was exquisitely tailored, the linen pristine, but he was convinced the scent of the yards still clung to him, a secret shame only he could detect. He stood near a potted fern, a glass of champagne feeling alien and frivolous in his hand, watching the spectacle of the ton. They were a kaleidoscope of silks and jewels, their laughter a bright, brittle music, their conversations a coded language of alliances and slights he did not understand. And then he saw her. She was standing near the French doors, a splash of cool elegance in a room of gaudy hues. Her gown was a simple, celestial blue, and her hair, the color of dark honey, was swept up in an arrangement that seemed both effortless and intricate. She wasn't laughing loudly like the others. Instead, she offered a quiet, listening smile to an older woman speaking to her. There was a stillness about her, a grace that felt utterly genuine. He watched, mesmerized, as she gently tucked a stray curl behind her ear, her gaze sweeping the room, and for a fleeting second, meeting his. It was not a look of recognition, nor of invitation. It was a simple, unguarded moment of observation. But in her eyes, a shade of hazel that seemed to hold flecks of green, he saw none of the calculated assessment of the other ladies, none of the predatory interest his new wealth had suddenly invited. He saw only a quiet curiosity and perhaps a hint of a similar loneliness. He felt a jolt, a visceral pull that had nothing to do with his fortune and everything to do with the woman herself. He learned her name by listening to the whispers that swirled around her like moths. Lady Eleanor Larkspur, the Earl's only daughter, the season's most elusive prize. For the rest of the evening, Arthur was a planet trapped in her orbit. He watched her, this daughter of an earl, a creature from a world so far above his own, it might as well have been the moon. And he, the poor man who had become a millionaire overnight, knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that all the money in England could not bridge the chasm between a coal merchant's son and the lady of Larkspur Manor. The real inheritance, he realized, was not the fortune, but the agonizing, intoxicating hope it had foolishly given him. The following months were a peculiar form of torture. Arthur was dismantled and reassembled in a grand, silent house on Grosvenor Square. Monsieur Fournier, a Frenchman with the patience of a saint and the despair of a poet, drilled him in the waltz, the quadrille, the subtle art of leading a lady across a floor without seeming to command her. Non, Monsieur Croft, you are not steering a coal cart. It is a suggestion, a whisper of the hand. Mr. Thistlethwaite, a retired Oxford don, attempted to fill the cavernous gaps in his education. They parsed Latin verses, debated the philosophies of Locke and Hume, and dissected the complex politics of the landed gentry. Arthur's mind, accustomed to ledgers and logistics, struggled with the abstract, but he was a ferocious learner. He absorbed it all, not for the love of knowledge, but as a necessary grammar, the grammar of a gentleman he needed to master if he were ever to form a coherent sentence in the world Lady Eleanor inhabited. His transformation was monitored by the ton with avid interest. The Millionaire Midas, they called him in the scandal sheets. Invitations flooded his doorstep, not because he was liked, but because he was a fascinating novelty. He was the fox brought into the henhouse, and the hens were too curious to be afraid. He attended soirees and musicales, his manners improving with each stilted conversation. He learned to hold his tongue, to offer a non-committal smile when faced with blatant snobbery, and to identify the few individuals who saw the man behind the money. The most notable of these was Lord James Ashford, a jovial, somewhat dissolute second son who found Arthur's bluntness refreshing. "Good God, man, you actually say what you think," James had exclaimed over a game of billiards. "It's terrifying and magnificent. Everyone else here speaks in riddles designed to conceal the fact they have nothing to say." It was through James that Arthur found himself, one bright afternoon in Hyde Park, part of the fashionable procession of carriages. He was driving a pair of fine chestnuts, trying to look as if he'd been born to the reins. And then he saw her again. The Larkspur barouche was just ahead, its canopy a splash of royal blue. Lady Eleanor was seated beside her mother, the Countess, a woman with a face like a hawk and eyes that missed nothing. As his carriage drew alongside, James called out a greeting. The Countess offered a thin, calculating smile, her gaze sweeping over Arthur and his equipage with the precision of an auctioneer assessing livestock. But Arthur's eyes were locked on Eleanor. Today, in the sunlight, she was even more breathtaking. She wore a simple walking dress of cream muslin, a wide-brimmed bonnet framing her face. She met his gaze, and this time there was a flicker of something more than curiosity. It was recognition. "Lady Eleanor," James said smoothly, "may I present my friend, Mr. Arthur Croft?" Arthur bowed his head, his heart hammering against his ribs. "My lady," he said, his voice thankfully steady. "Mr. Croft," she replied. Her voice was low and melodious, like cello strings. "I have heard much of your rapid ascent." The Countess's smile tightened. "Indeed, the talk of the town." Her tone made it clear it was not necessarily a favorable topic. "A fortunate turn of events, your ladyship," Arthur said, choosing his words with care. "Though navigating society is proving a far greater challenge than navigating the ledgers of my former life." It was a risk, acknowledging his past so openly. He saw the shock in the Countess's eyes, but in Eleanor's, he saw a spark of interest. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I should think a man who can master ledgers would find the rules of society a simple matter of arithmetic." It was a lifeline, a moment of connection. They spoke for only a minute more, trivialities about the weather and the park. But for Arthur, it was a conversation more significant than any business deal. As their carriages parted ways, he felt a warmth spread through him. She had not dismissed him. She had seen his awkwardness and had met him with a grace that felt like kindness. Later, at a small dinner party, he found himself seated not far from her. The conversation turned to industry, a topic the aristocracy usually affected to despise. One stuffy lord held forth on the blight of the railways on the countryside. Arthur, who had seen the way railways could connect villages, create jobs, and transport goods, and coal to those in need, listened quietly. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. With respect, my lord, progress cannot be held back by nostalgia. A blight to some is a lifeline to others. It is the duty of those who profit from it to ensure the lifeline is stronger than the blight. The table went quiet. It was a radical notion, the idea of responsibility towards the lower classes. He saw disapproval on many faces, but when he dared a glance at Alina, she was looking at him with an expression of deep, thoughtful consideration. She did not nod, she did not smile, but her gaze was intent, as if she were seeing him, truly seeing him, for the very first time. The coal merchant's son had spoken, and the earl's daughter had listened. The chasm, for a fleeting moment, felt just a little bit narrower. The Larkspur Ball was the pinnacle of the social season. The manor was transformed into a palace of light and music, every surface polished to a high gleam, every flower arrangement a masterpiece. Arthur arrived with a knot of anticipation in his stomach, feeling more like an imposter than ever. Yet, the clothes felt more familiar now, the cut of the coat less like a costume. He had a purpose tonight, a single, terrifying goal: to ask Lady Alina Larkspur for a dance. He saw her almost immediately. She was a vision in ivory silk, a simple strand of pearls at her throat her only jewelry. She stood beside her father, the Earl, a tall, imposing man with a kind but weary face, receiving guests. Arthur waited, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He navigated the crowd, exchanging pleasantries without hearing them, his focus entirely on her. When the line of well-wishers thinned, he approached. He bowed. Lord Larkspur, Lady Alina. The Earl offered a polite, non-committal greeting. Alina's eyes, however, held a warmth that steadied him. Mr. Croft, we are delighted you could join us. The delight is entirely mine, he said, and for once, the formal words felt true. He took a breath. Lady Alina, would you do me the honor of the next dance? It was a waltz, the most intimate, scrutinized dance of the evening. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, and the swift, calculating glance from her mother nearby. For a heart-stopping second, he thought she would refuse, offering a polite excuse. But she did not. She placed her gloved hand in his. I would be delighted. As he led her to the floor, a hush seemed to fall over their section of the ballroom. The Millionaire Midas was dancing with the diamond of the season. He could feel 1,000 eyes upon them, but the moment he placed his hand on the small of her back and took her hand in his, the world narrowed to the space between them. The music swelled, and they began to move. He had practiced for this. His steps were sure, his lead confident. For the first few turns, they danced in silence, the language of the waltz saying more than words could. She was light in his arms, following his lead with an instinctive grace that made him feel like a better dancer than he was. You dance beautifully, Mr. Croft, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. Monsieur Fournier would weep with relief to hear you say so, he replied, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time that evening. She laughed, a soft, musical sound that went straight to his heart. I suspect you are a man who masters whatever he sets his mind to. It is easier, he said, his gaze holding hers, when the incentive is so great. The air crackled between them. The implication hung there, bold and unmistakable. She did not look away, but a delicate blush colored her cheeks. They spoke of inconsequential things, the music, the beauty of the room. But every word was layered with a subtext he dared not name. When the dance ended, he felt a profound sense of loss as her hand slipped from his. He knew he should return her to her mother, but instead, he gestured subtly towards the French doors leading to the terrace. The room is rather warm. Would you care for a moment of air? It was a breach of protocol. To take an unmarried lady onto a terrace alone was to invite scandal. He saw the conflict in her eyes, duty versus desire. Desire won. With a barely perceptible nod, she allowed him to guide her through the doors and into the cool, jasmine-scented night. The terrace was deserted, overlooking a moonlit garden. The sounds of the ballroom faded to a distant murmur. You are very different from what I expected, Mr. Croft, she said, leaning lightly on the stone balustrade. And what did you expect? A man made arrogant by his fortune, or cowed by it? You seem to be neither. He looked out at the shadowed gardens. The fortune is a key, my lady. It has opened a door, but it does not tell me how to behave in the room beyond. I am still the man I was. I still smell of coal, in a manner of speaking. She turned to him, her face pale and lovely in the moonlight. I think, she said slowly, that a man who remembers the scent of coal is a man who remembers where he came from. And that is a rare and valuable thing in a world that prefers to forget. In that moment, under a canopy of stars, Arthur Croft fell utterly and irrevocably in love. He was no longer a millionaire playing a part. He was a man standing before a woman who saw the truth of him and who did not look away. The spell was broken by the sharp click of the terrace door. The Countess stood there, her face a mask of icy fury. Eleanor, come inside at once. People are talking. Eleanor's gaze met Arthur for one last, searing moment, an apology, a promise, a farewell. He couldn't tell before she obediently walked back into the glittering cage of the ballroom. Arthur was left alone in the garden, the ghost of her touch on his hand, the scent of jasmine in the air, and the chilling knowledge that his newfound wealth had just bought him a front-row seat to a battle he was desperately afraid of losing. The invitation to a private dinner at Larkspur Manor arrived 3 days later. It was not a friendly summons. The paper was thick, the script formal, and it bore the Earl's personal seal. Arthur knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was an inquisition. He was shown into the Earl's study, a room that spoke of generations of power. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors glared down from dark-paneled walls. The Earl stood before a roaring fire, while the Countess sat rigidly on a velvet settee. Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Croft," the Earl began, his tone not unkind, but firm. "Please sit." Arthur did, his back straight, meeting the Earl's gaze directly. He would not be cowed. "We are not blind," the Countess said, dispensing with any preamble. "Your interest in our daughter has not gone unnoticed, nor has your blatant disregard for propriety at our ball." "Your daughter is a remarkable woman," Arthur replied, his voice calm. "My intentions are entirely honorable." "Honorable," the Countess scoffed. "You are a merchant." "I was a merchant, your ladyship. I am now, by the quirks of fate and law, a gentleman of considerable means." "Means do not make a bloodline," she snapped. "You may have bought your way into our ballrooms, but you will not buy your way into this family. Eleanor is destined for a duke, a marquis, at the very least a man of unimpeachable lineage. Not a parvenu from the coal yards." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Arthur felt a hot flush of anger, but he kept it in check. He looked at the Earl. "My lord, do you share your wife's sentiments? Do you believe a man's worth is determined solely by his grandfather's name?" The Earl sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "Mr. Croft, society is a rigid structure. I have a duty to my name, to my lineage, and to my daughter's future. Your wealth is new. It lacks stability. It lacks history. The scandal of such a match would be immense. Eleanor would be shunned by the very circles she was born to rule. So her happiness is secondary to her social standing?" Arthur asked, the edge in his voice finally showing. "Her happiness is inextricably linked to her social standing," the Countess retorted. "You offer her a gilded cage in a world that would never accept her. We offer her a throne. The choice is simple." At that moment, the study door opened and Eleanor entered. She was pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I believe the choice should be mine, mother." "Eleanor, leave us," the Countess commanded. No, the single word was spoken softly, but with a steel that silenced the room. "I have heard enough. I have listened to you speak of Mr. Croft as if he were a problem to be solved, not a man to be known." She turned to Arthur, her gaze filled with a painful mixture of affection and resolve. "Mr. Croft, Arthur, what you offer is dazzling. It is a life of passion and possibility that I have only ever read about in novels. But my mother, for all her cruelty, is not entirely wrong. The price of that life would be the utter alienation of my family, the loss of my place in the world. I am not sure I am brave enough to pay it." Arthur's heart shattered. He saw the tears she bravely held back. He saw the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on her. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice raw. "I cannot," she said, her own voice breaking. "I am so sorry." He stood, the world tilting around him. The £1,000,000, the estates, the adulation, it all turned to dust. He had been a fool to believe it could be enough. He bowed, a stiff, formal motion. Lord Larkspur, Lady Larkspur. His eyes finally returned to Alina, memorizing her face one last time. Lady Alina, I thank you for your candor. He walked out of the study, out of the manor, and into the cold night. The victory he had felt in the garden was ashes in his mouth. He had gained a fortune overnight, and in a single evening he had learned its ultimate price. It could buy him a seat at the table, but it could not buy him the one thing his heart desired. The poor man had become a millionaire, but he had never felt more impoverished. London became a prison of ghosts. Every park, every street corner held the memory of her. Arthur withdrew from society. The glittering invitations went unanswered. He threw himself into the one aspect of his new life that felt real, the management of his fortune. He spent his days in the city, in smoky offices, making deals with sharp-eyed men who respected numbers, not names. He was ruthless, brilliant, and increasingly cold. The press, noticing his absence, began to run stories of the reclusive Midas, a man who had turned his heart to gold along with his purse. But the work was a hollow consolation. He would sit in the library of his Grosvenor Square house, a fire blazing, and feel nothing but a vast, echoing emptiness. The portrait of Sir Reginald Croft seemed to mock him from above the mantelpiece. The old man had given him everything, and in doing so, had shown him exactly what he could not have. It was Lord James Ashford who finally broke through his isolation, arriving unannounced one evening. "Good God, man, you look terrible," James said, pouring himself a generous brandy without being asked. "The word is you're becoming a miser. Hold up here counting your money. It is the only thing that seems to add up," Arthur replied tonelessly. James studied him. "It's Alina, isn't it?" Arthur flinched at the sound of her name. He said nothing. "I heard about the interview at Larkspur Manor," James continued, his usual levity gone. "A nasty business, but you're giving up too easily. What would you have me do? Challenge the Earl to a duel? I cannot force her to choose me." "No," James said, leaning forward. "But you can remind her why she was tempted to. You are not the man they think you are, Arthur. You are the man who spoke of responsibility in a room full of greed. You are the man who remembers the scent of coal. Stop trying to be one of them and start being you. The you that she saw on that terrace." James's words struck a chord. He had been trying to assimilate, to win their approval on their terms. He had failed. What if he stopped trying? An idea, audacious and terrifying, began to form. It was not a plan to win back Alina. He believed that ship had sailed. It was a need to be true to himself, to use this cursed fortune for the purpose his own father would have understood. He began quietly through intermediaries. He bought the soot-blackened coal yards in Southwark where he had worked himself to the bone. But he didn't sell them. He poured money into them. He built a proper office for the men, a warm canteen where they could get a hot meal. He established a fund for the families of those injured on the job, a concept that was radical, almost revolutionary. He didn't do it for praise, he did it because it was right. News, however, has a way of leaking. A paragraph appeared in a reformist newspaper praising the anonymous benefactor bringing humanity to the coal trade. Then, a London Times reporter, digging deeper, uncovered Arthur's involvement. The article was published under the headline, "The Millionaire with a Conscience. Arthur Croft's Quiet Industrial Revolution." It detailed his reforms, his investments in worker safety and housing. It contrasted his actions with the exploitative practices of other industrialists, many of whom were lords and gentlemen who sat in Parliament. It called him a new model of gentleman, one whose honor was proven not by his ancestry, but by his actions. Arthur was inundated with letters, some from fellow industrialists, calling him a traitor to his class. But many more were from thinkers, reformers, and ordinary people. He had accidentally become a symbol of something new. He was in his study, reading one such letter, when his butler announced a visitor. "Who is it?" Arthur asked, not looking up. "The Earl of Larkspur, sir." Arthur's head snapped up. There in the doorway stood Lord Larkspur, his face unreadable. In his hand, he held a copy of the Times. "Mr. Croft," the Earl said, his voice quiet, "it seems we have misjudged you." The Earl did not sit. He stood before Arthur's desk, a man accustomed to deference, yet his posture held a new, unfamiliar respect. "My daughter showed me this," he said, tapping the newspaper. "She has not been herself since you left our home. She argued with her mother, something she has never done. She told me we were fools, that we prized the gilding over the core of the metal." He sighed, looking every one of his years. "I have spent my life upholding tradition, believing it was the bedrock of stability. But this," he gestured to the paper, "this is a different kind of strength, the kind that builds rather than simply preserves." Arthur's heart was thundering. He dared not hope. "My lord, Let me finish," the Earl said gently. "I cannot approve of a match. The scandal would still be significant. My wife would likely never forgive me." He paused, his gaze steady on Arthur. "But I will not stand in its way. The choice, as Alina said, must be hers, and I believe she has already made it." He stepped aside, and Alina walked into the room. She was dressed not in fine silks, but in a simple, traveling dress of deep green. Her hair was down, flowing over her shoulders, and in her eyes was none of the hesitation or fear he had seen last time. There was only a clear, unwavering certainty. "Arthur," she said, her voice firm. He stood, unable to speak, his world narrowing to her presence. "My father is right," she continued. "I have made my choice. I choose the man who is not afraid of the scent of coal. I choose the man who sees a lifeline where others see a blight. I choose the man who looked at me on a terrace and saw me, not the Earl's daughter." She took a step closer. "I was a coward. I was afraid of losing my world, but I have come to understand that a world without you in it is not a world I wish to live in. Scandal be damned. Tears filled Arthur's eyes, blurring her beautiful, brave face. He moved around the desk and stood before her, close enough to touch. "You are sure," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It will not be an easy path." "It will be our path," she said, and she reached out, her gloved hand finding his. "And that is all that matters." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it with a reverence that conveyed more than any flowery speech ever could. Over her head, his eyes met the Earl's. The older man gave a slow, solemn nod, a transfer of trust, a blessing bestowed not on a fortune, but on a man. They were married a month later in a small, quiet ceremony, away from the glare of London society. There was scandal, of course. The Countess refused to attend. But Lord Larkspur was there, and so was Lord James Ashford, grinning like a fool. Arthur did not use his fortune as a key to a gilded cage. He used it, as he had begun to, as a bridge. He and Alina split their time between his growing industrial interests and the Larkspur country estate, where she taught him the language of the land, and he showed her the power of compassionate enterprise. One evening, years later, they stood on the same terrace where they had first dared to hope. The scent of jasmine was as sweet as he remembered. Their young son, a boy with his father's serious eyes and his mother's honey-colored hair, was sleeping upstairs. Alina leaned her head against his shoulder. "Are you happy, Arthur?" she asked softly. He looked down at her, at the woman who had chosen heart over heritage, courage over comfort. He thought of the long, difficult journey from the coal yards of Southwark to this moment. The fortune had been a seismic event, but it was not the story. The story was the choice they had both made to cross the chasm for one another. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of lemon verbena that was now, and forever, the scent of home. "I am not happy, my love," he whispered. "I am complete." The poor man had not just become a millionaire. He had, against all odds, found a love richer than any inheritance, a truth no amount of gold could ever buy. And in the end, that was the only fortune that mattered.